Hello and welcome to And Still We Rise. I'm your host, Christine Seidel, and today we have therapist Taylor Strong. Welcome, Taylor.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you for joining us. I would love to read a bio about Taylor and just kind of introduce you a little bit to who she is and the work that she does before we get into our topic, if that's okay. All right, it is through her own transformative life experiences that Taylor made the decision to obtain her master's in social work. After graduating from the University of Southern California, she cultivated her passion for therapy through education and application of all that she learned. The challenges she has experienced has given her a deep sense of empathy and a strong desire to help others navigate their own struggles. She's particularly drawn to working with adult women as she understands firsthand how complex and multifaceted life can be, balancing careers, relationships, personal growth, and everything in between. Taylor believes that real healing begins when individuals can feel secure enough to be vulnerable, to explore their emotions, and to confront whatever is holding them back. Yay. Welcome, Taylor.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I have the honor of working alongside Taylor, so I've seen firsthand just the amazing work she does with her clients, and we're so happy to have her on the podcast to talk about something that a lot of people really have a difficult time talking about, and I think as a culture we have a difficult time talking about,
Yeah.
and that is grief.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you work a lot specifically with people in the grief space. Whether it's individuals, that are going through that themselves, and
Mhm.
or family members that are trying to support others through that process. So, as complicated as grief is, how would you kind of describe it, and what are some of the misconceptions around grief?
I think that's a great question and a great place to start because I think that grief is just one of these really unique human experiences that we have. And it's very, unique to who we are and our experience just with the person. And I do kind of want to say that like I think in this podcast, like the grief that we're gonna be mostly focusing on today is the grief of like losing a loved one. But I think it is important to note that there's so many other experiences that can create grief, right? Like life transitions, loss of a job, loss of a home. These types of things can all bring about the feelings of grief. But I think that mostly today, like we're talking about losing a loved one, right? And experiencing that kind of grief. But I just think it's important to touch on that as well. Um, I think that a huge misconception or something that I think a lot of people think is that we cycle through grief in this linear progression, right? Like we just go through and we move through these stages really neatly. Like we have, I think it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then we have this like we reach this sort of like acceptance, right? And the fact of the matter is that just like oversimplifies this intensely complex process, right? So, what we know is that everyone's experience with grief is so different. It's so unique. It's unique to the person, it's unique to the relationship that they have with the deceased. It is something that is going to look different from person to person, and we just can't expect that it's going to be the same for everyone and we're going to be able to just neatly move through this process, right? And I think that grief is really unpredictable, right? Like, and that can be really frustrating for people who are experiencing grief because I think that one day you might be in this place where you're like, oh, like I understand. Like I do feel like, like I'm having peace with the fact that, my loved one's no longer in pain and no longer suffering, right? But then that very same afternoon, you might be, why did this have to happen? I miss them so much. Like, why can't they just be here? Why did they have to get sick in the first place?
Yeah.
And people feel so bewildered by this, right? Like, it's just so exhausting in so many ways to just cycle through all of these emotions. But I think that when we can allow people to understand that we're not just going to be able to start here and be in this and then get over it. we sort of introduce the concept more of moving forward into life rather than moving on and just accepting the loss. So,
Yeah, I agree. And I think that like what you said is like grief is such this unique human experience is because we just can't understand it fully. You
right.
know, when we look at from a therapeutic perspective, being able to come to terms with things, you know, we go through this awareness and acceptance process. And for death specifically, it's like it's so hard for us to wrap our heads around like what is this and why did it happen. I mean, there's just not a ton of answers for us, and so it does get very messy, and that's where you're saying like you find yourself in this very kind of like chaotic place of like I felt great yesterday, why am I feeling this way today, and
Yeah.
just being able to digest it in a linear way is just it's almost impossible. So
Right.
so tell us a little bit of how grief kind of shows up, like, you know, how it shows up physically, spiritually, emotionally, like how do people kind of experience grief from that perspective?
So I think that I also love this question too, because I think that what we're talking about too with like the physical manifestation of grief and otherwise known as somatic grief is so important to talk about because I think that a lot of times people experience that and they think like, there's something really wrong with me, right? But like it is very common to have loss of appetite, sleep disturbances, these kinds of things that happen when we're experiencing like really intense grief, like that will show up for us. We have to be really mindful just of, you know, leaning into sort of it's I guess more so tapping into our resources when things like that are happening because those kinds of things can really get away on you, right? Like, and it can be really exhausting because you have to think like some people, for them, it's like they just want to sleep all the time. They're feeling, and it's like that with depression too. Like it's either the sleep comes very easily and you have a lot of it, or you know you're not able to sleep at all and you're up thinking and your mind is going. And we know how important sleep is for mental health when you are in the best way. But you add on that component of grief, and it can be really, really difficult when you have these physical symptoms as well and this somatic feelings and or somatic grief that you're feeling. Um, yeah, I definitely think that that is a conversation that is really important to have too with someone who's grieving is how are you feeling physically, right? It's
Right.
not the mental energy that's being expended all the time.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is like just like grief itself, even the physical manifestation of that can be just varied and across the spectrum based upon the person. I've had people come in, you know, relatively soon after a loss, and they're like, I literally am just numb.
Yeah.
Like I can't access really anything. I can't access any feelings. And I'm like, yeah, your nervous system is pretty taxed right now. Like it's kind of protecting you
Mhm.
to kind of slowly digest
Yeah.
the trauma in the way that the nervous system has the availability to do. And so, you know, a lot
Right.
of times people will be like, I feel like I should be like, you know, not getting out of bed, or I feel like I should, you know, be anxious all the time, but I actually
Yeah.
can't access anything, you
Yeah.
know?
Right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
again, it's like one of those, you know, manifestations that if we could only say this is what you're going to experience in this way, it would
Right.
create such a support for people, but it's so different for every single person, you know.
Yeah, and I think going back to what we were talking about before, just about it being such a unique experience, right? Because you just like the sleep example, but also like what you're talking about is you might have people who, they're just feeling all the feelings and they feel like they're feeling too much. And then you have someone who is not able to feel at all. Or, you have people who do want to just lay in bed and that's really all they can handle at the time. But then there's others who go into this kind of hyper productivity mode where it's like they just want to do, to kind of push down, the feelings, or feel like, that's what makes them feel better. And we have to be really aware of that, again, that it is unique to the griever and who they are as
Yeah.
a person. And oftentimes, that may change, right? Like that may look different day to day as well.
Yeah. And, before we started recording, we actually said something. We were kind of talking about how, grief, of course, we physically have the manifestations, emotionally, we go through like all the different feelings, we're cycling through that whole grief process over and all over the place. But spiritually, grief is a difficult thing to grapple with as well. What are some of your thoughts about that?
So I have a couple thoughts about this, but I think that, yeah, I think that spiritually it's okay. I just want to tell people that, like, you're going to have questions, right? I think that I talk to a lot of people who are grieving, and they want answers, right? Like you had mentioned before, we don't really know, right? Like we don't definitively know. We don't have the answers. And I think that we want them. I think that that makes us feel like we might feel better, but I think that when you add in that spiritual component, um, it can either be helpful for people, or sometimes it can leave them with more questions. And that's okay too. And that's where I think that as someone who's supporting someone with grieving, it's okay to say, it's okay to not have the answers, right? It's okay that you're questioning this right now. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you a bad Christian or whatever it is that's making you question these things. But I do think that can be complicated at times. And
Yeah.
I think too, I wanted to bring cultural competency into the conversation. I think that that's really important when we are supporting people in grief, to understand where they are spiritually and what that means to them. And I think that that does look so different person to person. And for us to be respectful and aware that people have different practices and traditions, and it's going to be different in depending on their culture, right? And the thing is if that's not something that we understand, it's something that we should ask, and we
Mm.
should be respectful to the griever, that if they're not in a place to kind of give us that explanation, because they may not be, that may not be something that they have the capacity for, we ask someone who is a loved one to them, who maybe would be able to give us that information. And we come in this open way of supporting them and meeting them where they are as who they are and what their culture is. And I think that that is so important. And I know we're going to get into later just like well-meaning, things
Yeah.
we
Yeah,
say.
that's actually
Okay.
that's actually where my mind was already like
Yeah.
remembering some situations. And
Yeah.
I think this is such a dynamic concept to think about. Like when you're looking at this relationally, you have the person grieving, and then you have these loved ones of that person who genuinely are well-meaning, but
Yes.
as a culture we are highly
Mm,
uncomfortable with death and loss and people being in a grieving state. Like we're very uncomfortable on how to attune and attend. And
mhm,
I think sometimes that spirituality component can be a little bit of that harm that can be done
yeah.
too, right?
It become
If
tricky.
we're
Hmm.
Yeah, if we're coming in to bring the spirituality because we're uncomfortable with their discomfort,
Right.
it can get a little messy. So what are some things that people do, well-meaning people, right? Because they're there in that
Yeah.
space, but they're probably highly uncomfortable. What are some of the things that they may be doing in a very well-meaning way, but can actually be really not helpful to
Yeah.
somebody who's grieving?
Yeah, I think too, to touch on something you just said too along those lines, like that is us making an assumption too that someone holds the same belief that we have, right? And I think we have to be really, really careful not to do that, especially in these situations when we are trying to attune and attend to someone in their grief and in their experience, right? So I think that, you know, I think that people will say things like, they're in a better place now, right?
Yeah.
And the unfortunate thing is they are well-meaning. They are trying to alleviate the pain of the griever. They are trying to connect with the griever and they are trying to fix their pain, right? And this is an unfixable situation. This isn't something that, and I one of my clients made a comment just unless somebody had a time machine, right? And I'm like, right, absolutely. Like, unless someone had a time machine, like, we can't change this. But again, operating on that assumption that they hold the same belief as you, but then take it a step further. I think that when we make a comment like that, we are diminishing the pain a bit in a way of making the griever feel disconnected from their grief because they will start to question themselves like, well, why can't I just accept that they're in a better place? Why do I have to feel so sad right now? Why can't
Yeah.
I get peace from this statement? And then they're kind of in this like internal sort of conflict from this comment, right? And although it's well-meaning, it's now kind of created this space that the griever feels disillusioned, disconnected, and
Yeah.
hurting even more, right? And
Yeah.
I think that another one that people like to say is they're no longer in pain. You know, that's true. That is 100% true. This person is no longer in pain. And I think that that is one of these kind of tricky ones that does feel like something good to say. But again, I think that that's like one of these things where when someone is acutely grieving,
Mhm.
especially, they're not in a space to hear that because they're thinking, right, they're not in pain, but why did they even have to be sick in the first place? Why do they have to be gone? It doesn't make me feel better that they're not, nothing makes me feel better that they're not here because that's all I
Yeah.
really want, right? Is I just want that their physical presence. That's what I yearn for. That's what I'm experiencing right now. And so I was also thinking just like on what is and isn't helpful to say, right?
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that some people have the argument that saying I'm sorry is not the right thing to say. I personally feel that I'm sorry is an okay thing to say. You are sorry. You are sorry
Mhm.
that this person lost their loved one. But I think kind of partnering it with something such as, I'm sorry. I see that this is so painful for you, and I'm
Mhm.
here. I'm here for
Yeah.
you, right?
That's the key. That's the key right there. I think you just hit the nail on the head is everything else that you kind of use as examples was almost a way to escape
Hmm.
actually connecting with the person that's grieving. It's almost like, hey, I want to to be here for you, but I really want you to move to a place of
I want you
acceptance.
to move through this so I'm not so uncomfortable with this
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah. And what you're saying on the other side of like, I'm sorry, I can see how painful this is for you, is
Yeah.
somebody actually connecting to the griever to
Yes.
witness,
Yeah.
instead of the griever feeling somewhat isolated and disconnected in their pain and with the shame of like, well, should I be feeling like this? Am I like a bummer? Am I bringing down the vibe? Like, are people going
Yeah.
to not want to hang out with me? And when somebody is experiencing something, really what we all genuinely need is to be witnessed in that, you
Yeah.
know?
Be
And so
seen. Right.
well-meaning people want to be in a space with you, but
Mhm.
goodness, to see that pain and to witness that pain, that can be really uncomfortable for people. So something just as simple but genuine as I'm sorry, I can see you
Mhm.
is so powerful, I think, for people when they're in that place.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. What are your thoughts about timelines? Because, people, I think are fine understanding that grief can be a very intense experience, but not everybody has the same comfort with the timelines that people may be in
Right.
their own grief, and then timelines around people being there to help attune and attend to them in that grief.
No, I think that's interesting because I think that people do put parameters on like the timelines of how long people are allowed to grieve or, how long they're allowed to do this or that after the loss of a loved one, right? Like I can't believe she's already doing that, like, he's only been, I can't believe she's dating again. He's only been gone for a year, right?
So
People
yeah, either
people
side of that. Yeah.
Right, right. And so it's just, I think that is, I know in the DSM, right? So our diagnostic manual that we use as social workers and LPCs. So there is something called prolonged grief, and they used to call it complicated grief. And I believe it used to be only 6 months, and then they extended it out to 12 months for adults. And I think it's 6 months for minors, or children. But they say that if you are experiencing these like really intense symptoms of grief that we kind of connect to that really acute phase of grief, like such as like when things just have transpired and the physical symptoms, the very emotional, all of these things are taking place, that if it's taking place, and this is just like sort of the clinical perspective, but if it's taking place longer than a year and those kinds of things are transpiring longer than a year, then there's an issue that potentially would need clinical intervention, right? But I think that what you're more so asking is sort of the people around people who are grieving and like sort of their perspective of timelines and what's accepted and what's not.
Mhm.
Again, it's really going to depend on the person, right? And I've talked about this with my clients too, just like the way grief can look so different. I think in our life, like we have expectations, right? Of like we understand like what's normal and what's not, in a sense of like we have our parents and we have our grandparents and we have our siblings, maybe or not, and then there's us, right? We know our parents are roughly however much older than we are. We know our grandparents are however much older than we are, right? So it is likely in our timeline of life that there will be a time in our life that we will live without our grandparents. And that is just something that our brain understands. That's something we inherently understand from, basically once we kind of understand the concept of death and the finality of death and all of these things. But I think that when we are in a situation where there is a traumatic or unexpected death that takes place out of the natural progression of life and what that timeline looks like, that may take a lot longer for someone to cycle through grief, and there may be more resurfacing that takes place in it, in versus a situation of if you have someone who's lived a very long life and has passed away peacefully, that looks really differently, right? And
Yeah.
then you also add on people who have multiple losses, right? So we know that compounded grief is a thing. So you experience one loss and you experience another, and it can bring up feelings of the previous grief and exacerbate those symptoms, right? So,
Yeah.
I do think that a lot of these questions do kind of circle back to this answer of it is so unique to that person and their experience, and we have to be compassionate towards that they will go through their grief in the way that is unique to them, and there really is no timeline for that. And take the clinical stuff out, that is just the
Yeah.
case. So
And I think you made a good point, like also how that grief transpired, and what support system does someone really have in order
exactly.
to process through grief. I when I was in high school, I lost my little sister in a car accident, very tragic, very sudden. We were only 2 years apart. And, I didn't realize it till years later after I had, gone into therapy. But at that time, I couldn't process my grief. My family was grieving, my parents were grieving. There
Yeah.
wasn't really availability for me to actually grieve, because there was no support system. And when I would be with my friends, of course, like the initial few weeks after the accident, they
Sure.
were all there, they were grieving too. But I remember, like, coming, talking to this my poor little boyfriend, after about 3 months, and I was still kind of trying to process it, and he was like, "Don't you think
Right.
it's time to move on?" And
Mm.
I remember being so shocked by that because I didn't even feel like I had begun
Mhm.
grieving, and
Mhm.
I think that that's also something we can note, that grief can also be suppressed and repressed if it's not safe to process your grief. If you really don't have the support system, the resources, the
Right.
capacity, and I think about a lot of, children I've worked with, or adults who have had losses in childhood and very complicated after effects. Sometimes they come to therapy and have not even begun to process
Mhm.
grief, and so I
Yeah.
think that is something to acknowledge, is like not everybody has the support
Right.
system and resources to do that work.
Yeah.
Well-meaning people or not, maybe they're not even there,
Right.
whether
And
physically or emotionally.
right, exactly. They may have people who are there physically to support them and do, but they are not emotionally available to support that person in a way that they need at that time. And that is huge, right? Because I think too that kind of creates this cycle of feeling uncomfortable in your grief and sort of trying to mask it. And
Yeah.
as we know, it doesn't just go away, right? It goes somewhere unless we kind of process through it. And even if we do, it continues to come up. But when we repress it and we're just not allowed that space, it
Mhm.
can be really damaging.
Yeah, it definitely can. And so I think that that really resonates about how important it is to have community or a support person or
Yeah.
whatnot. So what suggestions or what recommendation would you make, to our listeners, to our viewers, whether they are somebody who's going through the grieving process themselves, or somebody who is witnessing somebody going through the grieving process and just genuinely wants to show up in a way to support them, whether through their words or support in other ways? What would you recommend would be the first steps to begin processing and digesting something so complex, but in a healthy way?
Right. So I think that like listening to this and sort of like getting this perspective is helpful, right? And I was able to write a blog that we published on our website at Rise. And that blog is specifically focused on holding space and not jumping to fix the grief of
Mhm.
the griever, right? Like viewing it from this lens of that I understand that this person that I am in connection with and in relationship with is experiencing something that is very complex and very
Mhm.
deep. And if I can just be here for them and hold space for them and witness them and honor that pain that they're experiencing, that is a gift in and of itself, which
Mhm.
is, per our conversation before, very hard to do, right? And you are
Yeah.
allowed to feel that in your body and say, this feels really uncomfortable to me. My natural inclination is to fix, right? Like that's why when somebody passes away, you automatically have 3 or 4 lasagnas sitting on your counter because
I'm healing you through my lasagna.
I I don't know what to do, so I'm going to
Yeah,
make food,
yeah.
right? Or I'm gonna send which are all really wonderful
Yes,
things,
absolutely,
right?
yes,
And
yeah.
I think that those things are wonderful too, but if this is someone that you are in connection with who is, like, really looking at you to be this supportive person, I think that letting yourself and allowing yourself to be that person who just holds space for them without trying to fix, that
Mhm.
is what is so needed for the person who is grieving. And all of those other things, like, like honoring the loved one and, like maybe creating rituals and things like that, those things can
Yeah,
come, right? But like they may not, just understanding and appreciating that they may not be in the space that they are there yet, where they
yeah,
can sort of wrap their mind around those things that may not feel good to them. And also
yeah.
just being open and being
Mhm.
understanding to them. Just about what their needs are and who they are uniquely as an individual. I
Yeah.
think that I think that caring for someone who's grieving is really difficult, right? I
Mhm.
think that that's you pouring into someone who really likely does not have the capacity to give anything back. So
It's that sacrificial, like, caring for somebody when they can't care for themselves almost, you
yeah,
know? Yeah.
exactly. And I do too, I like to think too, just like I thought of this example before, just like when so like with little kids, like when they're little, if they go outside and they like skin their knee, right? It's like our natural inclination just to like scoop them up, right? And just say, "Oh, how are you? Okay? And let's take
Mhm.
you inside. Let's fix it.
Right.
So let's clean off the wound. Let's like put some ointment on it and a band-aid." Whether or not
Mhm.
that's supposed to do anymore, I don't know. But, you know, just fix it for them. And I think that's what we want to be able to do with grief, right? And like we want that so badly,
Yeah.
but to know that that just isn't how this type of situation is fixed. You know what I mean? Like it's not just fixable just like that, right? It's not just like it is a wound, but it's not a wound that we can tangibly fix right away.
Yeah.
And when we are caring for someone who is grieving, we have to be, aware of how we are taking care of ourselves, right? And we talked about this before we started and really encouraging someone to, get the help that they need, right? Because for some people they may not be comfortable going to therapy or talking to someone and being someone who feels safe for them to talk to that about what it is
Mhm.
that they might be fearful of or what their concerns are or what that might look like and sort of working
Mhm.
that out with them like if there's any barriers to care there. And I think that taking a temp check for yourself on your own resources because we talked too about compassion fatigue. And essentially, what that is like you get to the point where you lack empathy, right? Because you are
Yeah.
just pouring, pouring, pouring from an empty cup, and you are no
Mhm.
longer having the capacity to, just continue to give. So I think before it gets to that point, because it can, and I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
being in mental health, we understand that as well, that you are making sure your resources are online, right? Like you are getting the support that you need. You are sleeping well. You are eating well, and you are nourishing your body and giving yourself what you need in order to be the support to that person.
Yeah, and I think that's the other side of the spectrum of whelming. People may, on one side they might be somewhat dismissive because they're uncomfortable with it, and on the other side of it, they might be a little too over functioning and
Mm,
to the point of their own, burnout or their own fatigue because, you know, they're almost not creating space for the person grieving to go seek that support in the places and spaces that can be a container for them. And I know we
mhm.
talked about like peer community and really going to a deeply rooted, grief focused therapist that those are places that can really be the container for somebody to process through this.
Yeah, and to feel safe, right? And we talked about that shared experience and
Mm.
and how important that can be. And I know in my own experience of grief, it wasn't until I met other people who had experienced what I experienced. And I'll never forget the first time I sat down in this group, I was like, wow, I feel seen and understood in a way that I have been not even knowing that I wanted until I
Mhm.
got here. And I just it's there really is something to being like, yeah, I get it. I get it. I see you and I get how painful that is. And although our experiences are not exactly the same, we are able to connect and understand each other in a way that others might not be able to. And as human beings we seek that kind of connection and commonality anyway, right? But in this
Yeah.
very unique intense experience it can be very, very helpful. So
And I
definitely.
think something you pointed out was, earlier was that oftentimes if we're not in community that hasn't had that same shared experience, sometimes our identity becomes
Mhm.
grief related. right?
Yeah.
Like I know my own experience was like, since none of my friends had experienced that before, there
Yeah.
was almost this kind of like, she's
Yeah.
the one who lost her
Yeah.
sister. She,
Right. That's
and you're
that
kind of like,
call.
oh, okay, that's
Like,
overshadowing, like just wanting to genuinely go out and meet new people and stuff.
yeah.
So I think in those peer communities, you kind of get to be yourself again,
Yeah.
you know, you get
Yeah.
to be you processing the grief versus, you
Right.
know, a loved one who lost their person,
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a great point.
Well, this has been just a very, I think, beautiful conversation. And Taylor doesn't know this, but before we started recording, she told me that she saw there was a cardinal outside her window.
Good.
And we, those of you that don't know, cardinals are kind of a symbol of our loved ones coming to kind of comfort us and let us know that the veil between the here and there is really not that thick. And interestingly enough, while we were recording, I have a window right over here to my left, and a cardinal fluttered up to the window twice. So very interesting little play out in
Oh,
our conversation. So,
that's amazing.
so we really appreciate everybody listening, everybody watching, and those that are here and those that are not.
Yes,
So.
absolutely. Thank you
And
so much.
I would love to put a link, Taylor, to your blog. So everybody listening know that I'll be putting her bio in the description. There will also be kind of like a timeline of everything that was talked about in this. Any socials that Taylor wants to share, where you can find her if you're looking to work with a therapist around this topic or any of the other topics that Taylor really is just extremely proficient in, please click on that, and we'd be happy to set you up with her. But we'll also put a link to her blog because it was really beautifully written and just a really great example of how to be in this space with people. So thanks again for joining, Taylor. It was so lovely to have you on here. I can't wait to have you on for many more. All
Yes.
right. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.